The Syrian army strengthens defences in northern Hama and prevents armed faction advances. Iranian foreign minister visits Damascus and reaffirms support for Syria and condemns Israel. And the former Israeli defense minister accuses Israel of genocide and war crimes in Gaza. Good afternoon, it's 4 o'clock Cairo local time and you're watching Q News. We begin today's bulletin with the latest developments in Syria. A Syrian military source has announced that army units have bolstered their defense lines in northern Hama in central Syria, thwarting any breakthroughs by armed factions in the area. Meanwhile, our correspondent reports that Syrian and Russian warplanes targeted armed factions retreating to southern Idlib. According to Syria's state news agency, 2 airstrikes hit the city of Idlib, while Syrian state television claimed that over 1,000 militants were killed over the past 3 days. The Syrian Ministry of Defense has announced the deployment of additional reinforcements to northern Hama. In a statement, the ministry confirmed that these reinforcements include personnel, heavy equipment and rocket launchers. It also noted that Syrian and Russian warplanes are intensifying airstrikes on militant movements, resulting in dozens of casualties and injuries among the factions. Syrian state television also reported that over 1,000 militants were killed during the past 3 days of operations. The Syrian army has secured several key areas in northern Hama, including Kalat al-Madik and Mardas, after driving out armed groups. That's according to military source quoted by state media. The source added that defensive lines in the region have been strengthened to prevent any militant breaches. Meanwhile, our correspondent reported that the withdrawal of armed factions from the town of Haifa, north of Hama, coinciding with the continued arrival of reinforcements to Syrian army positions on the city's outskirts. Thousands of people have been displaced in Syria following a recent escalation in attacks by armed forces. Families have fled Aleppo and the areas surrounding Idlib, seeking refuge at a camp set up for displaced individuals north of Idlib. The displacement follows recent assaults by armed groups, coupled with counter-airstrikes and shelling by the Syrian army. This surge in violence has triggered the largest wave of displacement in 6 years, with over 10,000 families believed to have fled their homes. Syrian Foreign Minister Bassam Sabah has reiterated the government's commitment to combating armed groups, emphasizing efforts to restore security, stability, and Syria's territorial integrity. He further stressed the state's commitment to preserving its sovereignty and unity. The Iraqi President, Abdul Latif Rashid, has emphasized the significance of developments in Syria and their regional impact during a meeting with the National Security Advisor. He called on the international community to shoulder its responsibilities in supporting regional stability. In a phone call with his Syrian counterpart, Iraqi Foreign Minister Fuad Hussein reaffirmed Iraq's solidarity with Syria in its fight against armed factions. The United States National Security Council has denied any involvement in the recent attack on Aleppo. A council spokesperson stated that Washington is closely monitoring the situation in Syria and has engaged with regional capitals over the past 48 hours to discuss de-escalation efforts, civilian protection, and launching a credible political process to end the conflict. The spokesperson emphasized that the United States will continue to defend and protect its personnel and military sites in the region.
Possibly opportunity because you have this change in government here. And so part of what President Biden will communicate is that we need to maintain stability, clarity, predictability through this transition between the United States and China.
Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is scheduled to visit Damascus today, carrying a message of solidarity with the Syrian government. Araghchi confirmed Tehran's support for Syria and its fight against armed groups and accused Israel of destabilizing the region following its failure to achieve objectives in Gaza and in Lebanon. So a new conflict has ignited in northern Syria, disrupting calm with escalating battles in Aleppo and Idlib. Here's our report.
A new conflict has erupted in northern Syria, breaking a prolonged period of relative calm. Armed factions launched a surprise offensive last Wednesday, targeting rural areas in Aleppo and Idlib, marking the first assault of its kind in 5 years. The Syrian army confirmed that elements of the armed groups managed to infiltrate significant areas in Aleppo's neighborhoods. However, the military highlighted that these factions failed to establish strongholds due to the army's continued targeted and intense strikes against them. In a statement, the Syrian army announced it's conducting a redeployment operation in Aleppo province to bolster its defense lines and counter the offensive. The army emphasized that the redeployment aims to secure positions until reinforcements arrive and can be distributed across the combat axis in preparation for a counter-offensive. The military further noted that fierce battles have taken place across a front exceeding 100 kilometers, with the army delivering concentrated strikes to halt the faction's advances. The operation successfully prevented the militants from solidifying their presence within Aleppo. Meanwhile, the Syrian Council of Ministers affirmed its efforts to create a supportive environment for the armed forces to achieve victory in Aleppo and Idlib. During a meeting to assess the evolving situation on the ground, the Council underscored the need of ministers to remain flexible and responsible in addressing the transitional circumstances, enabling state institutions to continue serving citizens effectively. The armed factions, on their part, claim to have made significant advances on both the Aleppo and Idlib fronts during their offensive. With the imminent arrival of substantial reinforcements for the Syrian army and reports of similar mobilizations by the armed factions, the conflict appears poised for escalation. The battles may soon extend beyond the Aleppo and Idlib fronts, signaling a potential broadening of hostilities across northern Syria.
Now, for more on the situation in Syria, we cross over to Selma in our newsroom. Selma.
Thank you, Mark. And for further analysis on the current situation in Syria, we're joined from Cairo by the editor-in-chief of Al Akhbar newspaper, Dr. Osama Al Said. Dr. Osama, thank you so much for joining us on Qnews. Let me first start by asking you, what are the key military developments currently unfolding in northern Syria?
أمام تطور مهم وخطير للغاية وهو
and
ارتفاع سريع
dangerous
لعدد من
development
القضاء
which is the fast mobilization of the factions, the militant, through the governorate of Aleppo and Idlib. And this would pose great dangers and risk with respect to redrawing the maps that been in place for the past period regarding the presence of some of the faction and the Syrian military and the possibility of intervening of the foreign parties. And of course, this would practice pressures for both all the parties and the path of the occupation of this militant to a great and important area and military base, in addition to the size of army owned by these factions that would let us to be before in a very different landscape of different analysis and would destabilize the areas in Syria, particularly that the Syrian president and the Syrian army announced that they are prepared for a retaliation and therefore to are in a very decisive moment of escalation and in a great confrontation. Affirms that the eradication of the terrorism still away from the Syrian territories.
So in light of the Syrian army responding to the attacks by the armed groups to retrieve the areas, what successes have been achieved?
Till this moment, there are several reports highlighted that the current clashes in some areas that never been in the hands of the militants. The Syrian army announced that they secured some areas, that the intelligence indicates that the militants are approaching these areas, which is very important. But in return, it was the fast fell down of several and vital areas and strategic roads in Aleppo governorate that raises questions about the ideas of the fighting preparations of the Syrian armies. But I think that the state of sudden attacks made by these factions, in addition to the non-presence of support from the allies to the Syrian armies that contributed these acts, and the awaiting situation and questions into the reaction and retaliation of the army that would define the results of the matters to this conflict that poses surprise for the supervisors in the Syrian territories.
Now, Dr. Osama, this ongoing fighting has resulted in a wave of displacement. What is the impact of it on civilians in the affected areas?
This compact and fighting would lead to the flees of hundreds of thousands of the areas approached by the opposition, militant and the extremists. There is a state of fear of the inhabitants of this area, particularly that they suffered of their presence of the militant factions during the past years and suffered and affected of the attacks along with the retaliation of the Syrian armies to these strongholds. There is a state of disturbance between these areas, and certainly we are before a very human and harsh disaster risks as these areas suffer of the difficulties of the roads, as well as we are approaching the winter season, that they suffer of lower degrees of temperatures and would lead to a great human problems, particularly that several of the human organizations do not or cannot work in these areas dominated by the militants. Therefore, these militants, rather civilians, would suffer in a state of the tensions that raised during the confrontations with these factions and the Syrian armies that they are preparing for retaliation.
Now, Dr. Osama, looking ahead, are there indications of potential escalation or de-escalation in the coming days?
Certainly, the possibilities of escalations are ahead, and there are several of the militants are moving towards new cities in attempt of using the surprise confrontation that they succeeded up till now. But I think that the Syrian army and their allied forces would have some sort of a reaction in the upcoming period. In all cases, that the battles will be doubled, particularly that these militants are following the hit and run operation, that they may operate in their operations in different areas, as well as the arrivals of some enforcement of these factions that will try to go through different fronts, and the indicators would prevail these escalations up in upcoming periods of times.
Lastly, Dr. Osama, how do you interpret Russia's support to the Syrian army?
Russia is a great ally to the Syrian government, and the Russian role has a decisive role to marginalize the situation of the Syrian faction or the Syrian armies. And the Aleppo governorate was a part of the Turkish-Russian security coordination during the past years. And I think that the Russian support to Syria will continue, but we cannot forget that Russia is very busy in their battles on the Ukrainian confrontation that would have an impact of the support to be provided to Damascus, would affect also the size of arms and the Russian participation before this militant, and I think their realization that that situation are one of the factors that encouraged the factions to execute their latest confrontations in Aleppo and in other several areas.
That was the editor-in-chief for Al-Akhbar newspaper, Dr. Osama Al-Said. Thank you so much for your insights. Now we're going to move back to Mark for more news and developments around the world.
Thank you very much, Selma. Now we get the latest developments in Gaza. Seven Palestinians have been killed and others have been injured in Israeli airstrikes on Gaza's central and southern regions. 2 children lost their lives when a tent for displaced people near Qnews was struck. 4 others were killed in the Palestinian city of Rafah while retrieving essentials from their destroyed homes. Another Palestinian died in a strike on a house in north of Al-Nusrat refugee camp. Israeli airstrikes on northern Gaza have targeted a residential building in Tel El-Zata, killing at least 40 Palestinians, including women and children, and leaving many trapped under rubble. Over 100 fatalities were reported across Gaza in 24 hours, with multiple bombings destroying homes in Beit Lahia, Jabalia and Khan Yunis. Civilians waiting for aid were also targeted, further highlighting the worsening humanitarian crisis amid limited rescue efforts and severe destruction. Kuwait Emir Mishal Al-Ahmad Al-Jabir Al-Sabah has announced support for Saudi efforts towards a two-state solution. That came at the 45th Gulf Summit, where he praised Egypt and Qatar's role in Gaza ceasefire talks. Chairing the summit, he reiterated the Gulf Cooperation Council's commitment to a Palestinian state based on international frameworks and condemned Israeli actions in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria and Iran, and called for Gaza civilian protection. The summit addressed Gaza, Lebanon, Sudan and Syria. A 15-year-old Palestinian child has been injured by Israeli occupation forces during a raid in Anabta, east of Tulkarm, in the occupied West Bank. The child sustained head injuries from live ammunition shrapnel and was treated by the Palestinian Red Crescent before being transferred to Tharbet Hospital, where his condition is reported to be moderate. This incident underscores the ongoing violence during Israeli incursions into West Bank towns, which frequently harm civilians, including children. The NGO Save the Children has announced that one of its staff members was killed in an Israeli airstrike on Khan Yunis in Gaza. The organization stated that this marks the second staff member they have lost in the region since the war began on October 7th last year. Save the Children condemned the attack, calling for an investigation. Israel, which denies targeting civilians, has yet to comment. Israeli occupation forces have arrested 4 school children during a raid in Al-Mughaya, northeast of Ramallah. Soldiers stormed homes, ransacked belongings and took the children during an ongoing week-long crackdown. Earlier, the village had endured repeated raids, detentions, house demolitions and military measures. Israeli occupation forces also seized a home for over 30 hours, turning it into a field interrogation center, further intensifying pressure on the community. Former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon has reiterated the Israeli ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. He warned that Israel's actions align with the finance minister's calls to reduce Gaza's population and restore settlements, adding that war crimes are being committed in northern towns like Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun. Hamas has called for an international committee to investigate Israel's use of internationally banned weapons in northern Gaza. In a statement, Hamas cited reports from civilians and doctors describing attacks with munitions that vaporize bodies, accusing Israel of using prohibited weapons during its 53-day military campaign. Hamas called on the international community, the United Nations, and Arab and Islamic nations to take action, halt these violations, and bring war criminals to justice. The White House National Security Council spokesperson Sean Savette has stated that U.S. President Joe Biden is relentlessly pressuring Hamas to release detainees in Gaza. Savette emphasized that the war and suffering could end immediately if Hamas cooperated. He reaffirmed Biden's commitment to securing the release of detainees through diplomacy, sanctions, and continuous efforts.
The people of Gaza, they too deserve an end to the fighting and displacement. People of Gaza have been through hell.
Protests calling for a Gaza ceasefire have taken place in almost 50 Spanish cities, with prominent artists, filmmakers and actresses participating. Earlier, Madrid hosted a major event featuring performances calling for peace and a video condemning the genocide in Gaza. Meanwhile, 15,000 artists from 35 countries, led by a Spanish initiative, issued a joint statement urging global action against war and supporting Palestinians' right to statehood. And that's almost all we have time for right now, but here's a look back at the headlines. Syrian army strengthens defenses in northern Hama and prevents armed faction advances. The Iranian foreign minister visits Damascus and reaffirms support for Syria and condemns Israel. And the former Israeli defense minister accuses Israel of genocide and war crimes in Gaza. And that's all for our news bulletin for this hour, but don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at Qnews EGY. Coming up next is In Depth. Thanks for watching.